Welcome back to another episode of The Loco Fit Show, where we redefine what healthy means to you. I'm your host, Lauren Conlon, and this week I'm joined by Rick, our team mental health counselor, and we are going to go into, I guess it's kind of a part two. We did an intro to Carl Jung's work, kind of like a general overview, and I would say that most people are familiar with shadow work, or at least they've heard the term. I feel like it's one, super important, but two, very misunderstood. So I wanted to do a follow-up podcast to dive a little bit more into shadow work. So we did discuss that in the first one, and kind of an overview of a lot of his work. He has a lot of work. We just covered a few of the most important things in that last podcast. We really wanted to dive more into shadow work on this episode. So here we go, part two.
All right, so let's talk about what the shadow is. The shadow is an aspect of the unconscious, right? To roughly define what the shadow is, it's the repressed or suppressed aspects of the conscious self. These are the dark aspects of the psyche. That's a very basic fundamental way of looking at it. In a nutshell, that's what it consists of. So when somebody's talking about doing the shadow work, what they're really talking about is looking at and exploring the unconscious motives, the things that drive us, that create behavior that we don't understand where it comes from or why it happens. That most of the time it's coming from this place of the shadow, and it's in that place because it's been socially unacceptable, or we've been taught to not explore these areas. We're going to get into some of that, how that develops, and so it gets repressed. We call it like in the darkness, the dark parts of the psyche, because we're unaware of it. And so the purpose of doing shadow work is to take things that have been repressed or suppressed, these unconscious motives, right, and move them to the surface to integrate them with our complete awareness, to no longer realize that this is not an unconscious motive, right? It's not something that's moving me and I don't know why. I know why it's moving me, and now I have the ability to control it. I have the ability to understand it. And that's the part, is this is really about gaining insight into your own behaviors and your patterns. And sometimes people, this is not a lighthearted topic. I question sometimes where people are and why they're doing shadow work. I really am interested in it because some of this is going to be realizing parts of yourself that you might not want to touch. One thing to do shadow work or to do therapy in general is one of the general rules or principles is don't tear down the wall unless you have something to put in its place. Sometimes these defense mechanisms exist for very specific reasons. So unless you're prepared to, I guess, explore all aspects of it sometimes, it's really important that you don't go digging around and trying to find answers to things that maybe you don't really want to know the answers to. In some ways, ignorance is bliss for people. You can get to a space where we're happy, content, so to speak, with what we're feeling. And then, people will back off, and that's okay. Each person's on their own individual journey. I'm not here to judge it. But that's essentially what shadow work is.
So as a therapist, would you, and this is just a hypothetical situation, so if somebody is ready to, like maybe certain patterns keep coming up, and you're like, hey, I have a kind of a hunch that it might be because of these things, or do you want to explore, like how would a therapist go about bringing this up to a client? And then likewise, how would a client maybe bring this up to a therapist as something that they might want to work on? Granted, they're still kind of new, working with a therapist, and maybe because, when you're coming to therapy, you are ultimately presenting what you want to present, and you're sharing what you want to share, and sometimes you are purposefully avoiding sharing certain things, and sometimes you maybe you haven't meshed right with that therapist, or maybe they haven't asked you for whatever reason. So what would be the dynamic of this conversation when working with a therapist?
Well, I think it has to be explored within the individual relationship, right? Is the person looking for a deeper understanding as to what is creating these motives and why they're happening and looking for behavior change? Or are they just simply looking for a behavior change where they don't really necessarily care as to why it's happening? I just want to know some steps and things that I can do differently. Every person's a little different. I think when people are coming to me, and we'll get to this toward the end, I'm listening for things that they have strong emotional reactions to. I'm listening for things that are judgments, right? Because that's about themselves or about other people. More likely other people.
Which is really a reflection of maybe them.
Well, it's an area of, and we're going to start getting into this, is that what we don't like in other people is oftentimes inside us. And so we reject and we criticize and we judge other people for doing something that we fail to recognize within ourselves. And so that's where the projection comes from. That's where denial comes from. And these are typical ways that people will deal with the shadow, is to deny that it's existing, or to be so unaware of it that they're continuing to project it onto the people that are around them. So we'll get into that. And one of the kind of ways to start this conversation would be, to go back to some of Carl Jung's teachings. And human beings generally do not like to think about themselves in their own negativity. So what happens is we tend to push our thoughts and feelings into the darkness because it makes us feel better and it's easier to ignore it. So essentially what I want you to think about is sometimes whatever the threat is, it's our way of pushing the threat away. Okay? And this process is what hinders self-development. And so part of understanding the shadow is this, and this is a far-reaching concept that I want people to understand. Shadow work isn't about judgment, right? Judgment is taking a position on something. Shadow work is actually removing the judgment. So what I mean by that is I want you to start moving beyond concepts of good and bad, right or wrong, evil, right? By removing the judgment from those experiences and the aspects of yourself, you move toward the concept of a complete person. Not a good person, not a bad person, but a complete person, okay? You're not good or evil, but a complete human. And so when we stop relying on the truths that have been told to us, it allows our conscious to kind of feel out our own truths through our own consciousness. And that's what Carl Jung kind of really starts to get into with his teachings. And so I think with people, one of the difficulties is learning to accept that you are not the good version of yourself that you've projected to the world. Excuse me. Carl Jung wrote, and this is one of my favorite quotes from him, as a whole, man as a whole is less good than he wants to be. Everyone carries a shadow. Unless it's embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it becomes, right? So what's he saying there? That we aren't good human beings by nature. Human beings aren't the things that we try and portray ourselves to be, right? And there's so many different versions of this, but we spend our lives developing defense mechanisms to protect ourselves from the person we actually are, right? And we want to believe we're something better and more wholesome and good. Well, what is wholesome? What is good? What is better? Those are judgments, right? I'm elevating myself in juxtaposition to some other value that I deem not appropriate. So I'm making myself better. I'm this more improved version of myself. And the reality is we have created personas to gain acceptance by our peers and project to the world a version of ourselves that we're not, okay? Social media is the perfect representation of this version, right? I watch it all the time. I watch people post their virtues about the world, their favorite Friedrich Nietzsche quote, what they're going through and doing throughout their day. They project the perfect version of themselves into the world, their attitude, their outlook, their motivation for the world. They put all this out there when inside they're lonely, they're weak, they're desperate, they're angry, they're worthless. And that's not the image that they're projecting forward. And so literally, like, social media has become a persona in and of itself to project this false reality of who we are, right? I want everybody to see this. Forget even collecting the likes. I'm just putting out what I want everybody to see. The fabulous life that I have, the great person that I am, the motivator, all these things. Mm-hmm. And it's that inability to really connect with who the person is on a deeper level.
So there's a few things I want to say about that. So first, all the things. First, I guess, what is the alternative though, right? So as a person who's sharing something on social media, right? Mm-hmm. As the person who's sharing, there is a level of vulnerability mm-hmm. that I think is useful. But then I also think that there's a point where you probably shouldn't be sharing that, right? Like, those are things that you should probably keep to yourself. And there's certainly people who overplay that angle as well, right? So it's like, what is the right I mean, and this is a judgment. What's right, what's wrong? There is no answer, right? Like, I'm not, this is just a hypothetical thing I'm posing. Like, what is the right thing to share or not share? Because if you only share this perfect life, right, or who you want to be, and you're not sharing the other things, the loneliness, the anger, the regret, the whatever, but maybe those are things that you don't want to share. Likewise, is sharing those things useful, or is that now keeping you stuck, and is that oversharing, right? Like, it's like this really weird spot, because how do you come out ahead, and then like as a person, not like I'm talking about like social media and likes and stuff, but like how do you come out ahead, like keeping yourself intact, but then also helping people and showing everything, but not showing too much. And like it's like this, I don't know what the right thing is. And this is something that I've always struggled with, because it's like, well, first of all, I don't want to just share to people who like, anything that you put out, anybody can see technically, right? And that's what happens. Some people who are your followers can see it, but other people, sometimes people just stumble upon it, right? So anything you put out can be seen by anyone at any given period of time. They could see a post you made 2 years ago, right? Which would be unlikely, but they could. And so it's, like, do you want to share all those things with people? Like, probably not. I get what you're saying, but it's like, I don't know what the right solution there is either, of like striking that balance of like sharing enough to be vulnerable and open, and like maybe sharing those other sides.
I don't know.
I know what you're saying. Like,
the original intention behind social media was to create what it's become today. I don't know if it's the right platform to be sharing those things.
But then what do you say?
What did people do prior to social media, before Facebook and Instagram existed and TikTok and all that kind of stuff? This isn't work that most people didn't have a platform to run to the internet and like share what they've learned. This is an individual process where they're sharing it with their families and their loved ones. That's where that vulnerable space comes from. Social media has transformed and transmutated into something that no one expected. It was originally a way for Mark Zuckerberg to get laid, right? To meet single people, to date, to connect. And from that...
I know, but now here we are, so it's like, what do we do?
And what I'm saying is I don't know if social media is the proper platform for people to be displaying these things. I think it's a version that continues to perpetuate an inauthentic self.
So you think that everybody should refrain from sharing?
Everybody.
No. Okay, I'm saying, like, as a general thing, you think that people should refrain from sharing personal, like a personal brand, right? Because
look, if you're going to use something as a business platform, use it as a business platform.
But
if you're going to use it as a vehicle for self-discovery, I don't know what you're going to get out of it. I don't know what it gives you back.
Yeah. I'm just asking. I'm not like...
I'm answering the best of my ability. I mean, I have a client who had a career as a motivational speaker, right? And through therapy, what we discovered was that it wasn't about motivating other people. It was about the self-fulfilling gratitude that came from the elevated position, right? So this person's no longer a motivational speaker. Like, they've chosen because what they recognized was they were doing this and it was kind of repressing who they authentically were, and they were getting this version of themselves praised and validated that wasn't real and authentic to who they were, and that conflict that had been created within them was more important to resolve that conflict and step away from the career as a motivational speaker for the health and reality of accepting himself for who he was and who he wanted to become and these other aspects. So he had to move away from this public image of himself that he had created, that everybody loved and praised and got all this, but it was inauthentic to who he was. And he wasn't a complete person. And he's like, I don't want to just live in these fake virtues anymore. I want to be real with myself. And it was so important that they moved away from that career. And so that's kind of the space that this enters sometimes is, and that's where social media, and we don't have to spend too much time on social media because that's like a whole separate topic, but I don't know what it gives back to people other than reinforcing whatever it is you're putting out there, which many times isn't an authentic way. If you're sharing pictures of yourself or your family and your friends and you're just like, here was a fun weekend, to stay connected with my friends and family and to see pictures of your nieces and nephews who live in California grow up. Like, fine, it's fun and it has a purpose. It has transformed into something very different for people. And it's through that transformation that I don't know if this is the right tool or venue to be sharing and looking for an authentic self, because I don't know what it gives back to you. And we could do a whole other podcast on that.
Because I think that that's, like, I'm asking these questions because this is really important, because a lot of people are doing that in the sense of sharing in terms of a personal brand, because most businesses are built off of personal brands. Whether that is a business personal brand or an individual, and that's becoming much more common. So when you talk about using something for a business, well, technically a personal brand is building that person's business. So it's like, how much of that do you share? How much of it do you create? And I cannot remember if I talked about this on a podcast or not, and everybody forgive me if I already did. But I just saw this other video. The only other channel I go on YouTube is called After School. They talk about a lot of this kind of stuff too, like psychological stuff, philosophical things, and they do really cool drawings with it. So it's really nice. But and the one topic, I'm going to kind of butcher it, but it was one of the most recent ones. And it's basically how the audience creates the influencer. And how the audience shapes that person. Because what happens is then they use this example of this guy who was like a violinist or something, and then he was a vegan, and he was sharing his views, and he's this kid and whatever, and then all of a sudden he decided to stop being a vegan, and he became he started doing mukbangs, which is eat on camera. And that started getting a lot of views because people like these kind of videos blow up, and then it became like, oh, do this, be more extreme. Why don't you do this food challenge? Why don't you do this? And then it became all these things, and now the guy is morbidly obese. I don't know where he is now, if he's gone on a journey or not, but I hope he does, because it was honestly, I was watching it, I was so close to crying, just not his physical appearance, but just seeing the transformation, and it was just so sad, because it was oh my gosh, now this person is literally just chasing what has been created as their image, right? And so the audience essentially is creating this influencer, so it's all of these, and
that's a perfect representation of what
you're talking about.
Yeah, so he repressed various aspects of who he was, and the world told him what to do, which is what we've done. We've taken values and traits that are consistent within human beings, and over years we've said these are bad, and so we've learned to repress those aspects and put forth the version of ourselves to the world that everybody else wants to see. And so we're not whole or complete people, and that's what happens with that person. It happens all the time, right? There's a jiu-jitsu guy, right? No one gives a shit about this guy other than through his jiu-jitsu, but he happened to make a post of something that he was eating, and so this whole separate thing has spun off where it's this jiu-jitsu guy eats food, and so there's people who follow him just for his diet, what he's eating, what he's making, versus the only thing that he really has to offer is quality.
Is it funny stuff? Is he making it funny, or
no? I think he's generally showing people what he cooks and what he's making, and so
But so that's an example of a personal brand. He's building a personal brand,
right? And are you building a personal brand, or are you more interested in self-growth and development?
I don't know what he is, but I'm just saying that's how somebody would spin that,
Right.
So it is, but then at the same time, it's well, then why not share the stuff that you're learning? You know what I mean?
Well, and I think this is the important part to distinguish between. There's a difference between building a brand and a business and self-development. And so if we're talking about this from a self-development perspective, that's where I would want to keep it. Not necessarily about building a brand for yourself.
Building a brand, but just sharing, hey, I learned this, or I saw this.
And that's,
but again, what you're saying is that can potentially maybe hinder your progress?
It can, because you said before, when you start posting things and you're looking for the gratification that comes with it, the validation that comes from the likes, the comments, the people oh my God, yes girl, this is amazing, and you're amazing, and oh my God, you're beautiful, and more like this, God, you spoke to me on a different level. It's okay. And so what happens is people start filtering that, because that's what the public wants. That's what their followers, quote, want. Yeah. And so it's not about their personal journey and development into discovering aspects of themselves, but giving people what they want, which is literally a persona, which is creating that image and projecting it to the world of what I think you want to see rather than who I really am. And so when we're talking about shadow work, to kind of really move back to the central topic, is we're talking about integrating shadow work into our conscious awareness, like being aware of these other forces. So an integrated person knows that whatever is wrong in the world is actually wrong within themselves. Okay? Learning to deal with the shadow means actually doing something for the rest of the world. Okay? For the people in your life, for the people in your community and society. The only thing you can control is you. And so I feel like what happens is we get lost or wrapped up into much larger causes and things that we can't really affect change with. And we lose the ability to say, look, the one thing that is within my control is me. And if I really want to change the world, where to start is within myself, right? Because that's the only thing within our control. And everybody's always worried about something grander, large, big picture kind of stuff, like I've got to do this, and that virtue signaling thing that comes with it, rather than looking at themselves and saying, like, what is it within me that I can start to change?
Because then once you do that, then you recognize that, like, maybe those are the things that, like, all the stuff that you're, either arguing against or fighting against, like, you have all those aspects within yourself.
Yes.
And it is frustrating because I think, like you said, people want to feel like they're making a big difference, and it feels like you'd be making a bigger difference if you're standing behind something really large. But the reality is, like, how much you can, like, move or navigate that is going to be a lot smaller than if everybody just focused on an individual level to say, hey, I'm going to be like my most excellent version of myself, the most integrated version. And because, like you said, that is the only person you can control. But if we all actually did that,
correct,
then we would really collectively be a lot better, And that's actually something I have to really remind myself of all the time with coaching. So I'll be like, what I do is so minuscule. You know what I mean? Like nutrition, somebody's habits, their mindset, their training. Like, does this really matter? Sometimes I'll get down when I'm thinking about, like, bigger problems and bigger situations. And then I have to say, okay, no, if I can help someone in this small area, then that could potentially free up other areas in their life where they can pursue more growth and excellence and integrate themselves. And then they can be a more high-function individual, which then can contribute to society in a bigger way. But I think it is so easy to get stuck in that, like, big picture, like that grander, like, oh, I'm a part of this. And that's not to say you can't do that, but you should focus on yourself first.
Yes.
Especially because I feel like what happens is people want to make that change, but it is really frustrating when you're a part of a big group because you don't have that much influence. Even if you're the top person, you know what I mean? Like, when there's a lot of other people involved, it's going to be a lot harder to make a substantial change versus if you are focusing on you and then maybe, like, your immediate, family, stuff like that, you'll actually be able to make more of an impactful change.
Yeah. So to understand the shadow, there's a concept that I want everybody to really start to explore, which is the concept of kind of opposing forces, okay? Opposition. And what I mean by that is the good and evil, the devil and God, healthy and unhealthy, angry and calm, the opposites of a teeter-totter, so to speak, like that balance, okay? And so I think with shadow work, one of the easier places to start is with the emotion of anger. Anger is an emotion that everybody feels, man or woman. It's the most common space, and it's one of the easier concepts to start to dissect, so to speak, especially in a platform like this where we're trying to educate and learn about it. So by and large, early in our lives, we were told that anger is generally considered to be negative. And we've been taught that message has been received to us and taught to us through the social framework that we live in. Our view of anger growing up as kids, as young, small children, is very narrow. It's incomplete in many regards. It's limited. So anger becomes repressed because it's unacceptable to society, right? Like, when you see a kid who's really upset, what's the first thing that we do as parents? We're like, stop crying. Don't be angry. You're taught literally by your parents, by your family, by society, by the community to repress aspects of an emotional response that is human, right? And so what happens is your anger response gets shoved into a space where you're not supposed to display it, especially if you're throwing, like, a tantrum, right? Where people are going to really call you out on it, especially your parents. And depending on who your parents are, how they correct that behavior can be even more damaging and more repressive, right? Especially if it's followed up with abuse, or if we're judging you even harsher for it, right? Name calling, withdrawing from the relationship from you because you're angry. These are very common things. Neglect happens, and sometimes it's totally unconscious motive by the parents. But what's the message that we receive? That anger, by and large, is considered to be negative, and our view of it is very incomplete, right? And what do I mean by that? Well, as we grow and mature in life, we understand the dichotomy of anger, right? And that we learn as we get older that anger actually has some positives to it, don't we? Right? Anger is not always a bad thing. Anger provides direction, it provides change, motivation, leadership, survival. Those are all positive, affirming values and beliefs that come with anger. And so because it has these redeeming qualities, it also is redeeming to the person, the community, and society. These are confirming principles of anger, okay? So there's the juxtaposition of anger. We have the emotion, and on one side we're taught that it's destructive and hurtful and hateful and aggressive and it's not good. And then the other side of it is it's like, well, anger actually provides benefit to the person as well as the community. And so you start to see where some of the repression starts to take place. And so, and we can kind of come back to this. This is like more like a personal observation that I've had, is I believe part of the issue, so the problem starts, you can begin to make the argument that as children we don't possess the ability to cognitively understand the various dynamics of something complicated like that, like anger. Explain that to a 6-year-old that like anger's a negative thing but also a positive thing. And their kind of head starts to spin on an axis because they don't really understand it. So like a perfect example of something like this would be a concept of fairness, right? If you take 2 kids out, like you have a son and a daughter, and your son does great at his baseball game, right? You're like, let's go out for ice cream. Well, let's say your daughter didn't do anything that day, right? Do you just buy him ice cream or do you buy her ice cream as well? What are you going to do, Lauren?
We're all getting ice cream, me included, so that was a terrible example.
Right. So the idea is that children, we learn that the world...
But really, what is the right... I don't know what the right...
You buy both of them ice cream.
Okay, I'm like, I don't know. Is this another trick question?
No. So we begin to see the world as fair, right? Because I bought little Joey ice cream, I've got to buy Susie ice cream as well. So the idea of fairness is this belief system that we put in place when we're kids. The idea that the world must be a fair place and fairness must triumph, right? Is that the case when we get older? Does fairness apply itself to things?
Nope.
Nope, right? We learn quite the opposite, that the world isn't a fair place and that fairness doesn't always triumph. But here's the problem. It starts to conflict with the worldview that we had as a child when mom and dad bought us both ice cream. Mm-hmm. We were equals. Everything was fair. And so we hold on to this childlike brain. We stay stuck in childhood. I work with adults who are, I'll hear it all the time with adults. Oh, well, so-and-so was doing this and that just isn't fair. And I'm like, since when is the world a fair place? We still have an expectation that the world is fair. We know that it's not cognitively, right? And rationally we know that, but when it's not a fair place, we get upset by it. When a police officer gets off for something he shouldn't have gotten off for, or when a school teacher does something that they weren't supposed to do, everybody's like, oh, well, they should be punished for that. Well, the world's not necessarily a fair place, and so they don't get punished for it. And so it creates this like imbalance within us where we're like, well, this just seems not fair, this isn't just. So we start to see the conflict in these values early on, and so we still hold on to our childish beliefs, our feelings, our perceptions of the world, and that continues to stay with us even as adults. And so what I feel like happens is because that mindset is there when we're kids, and it doesn't necessarily get challenged, even though as adults we're able to see both sides of anger, we don't always view it in the same regard. We're not looking at anger as a positive, reaffirming value within our system or ourselves.
And would you say that if somebody is repressing that or having those thoughts around it, that they are maybe using anger in that negative sense? Because
they're either using it in a negative sense, which can be true, or they're not using it at all, and that's making them even more angry.
I would say they're still, I guess, how do I phrase this? They were somebody who maybe is expressing angry emotions. They're not seeing any of the positives of it because they are only viewing it from this negative lens. Mm-hmm. That's more so what I mean.
Yeah, so like the impact or the impractical aspects of anger are used as a deterrent so that we repress all possibility that encompasses the emotional expression of anger. Because I view anger as negative, even though there's positives to it, I'm going to repress those positives and stifle all of my anger.
And okay.
Right? So I'm not going to show, because I know anger is negative, I'm not going to show any anger, and I'm not going to acknowledge the positives of it, right? Because of the negatives that are associated with it. Okay?
Not that it would come out more so.
It can.
Or could.
You know, there's a difference between people who when they say, you know, this is always funny to me, when people are like, I have an anger problem. Usually it's men who are coming to me saying that I have an anger problem. And to me, one of the first things is to look at people and I'm like, when I hear that, what I hear is it's not just an anger problem that they have. In fact, usually it's not anger that they have a problem with. What they have a problem with is expressing other emotions, like depression, sadness, guilt, shame, embarrassment, right? Why? Because no one ever taught them how to do those things. And so here comes the problem. When the only tool I give you is a hammer, everything begins to look like a nail, because it's the only thing I have in my arsenal. And for some people, anger is a survival tool, right? So they've learned that the only way they're going to get what they want is through anger. And so then it takes a different tone with them, and it's not necessarily a repressed aspect of themselves, but kind of the opposite. We need to get them to recognize the danger that comes with their anger and acknowledge and not see it as just a beneficial thing, but start to recognize the other side of the danger and the unhealthy habits and the safety that it creates, or lack of safety that it creates in other people. And so you're kind of trying to always strive for balance. And so when I talk about balance of those opposing views, that's what we're striving for in therapy. The acceptance of you as a person that possesses both dichotomies, the good and the bad, so to speak, right? To blend into that neutral person. But reality is you're a complete person.
And when somebody is coming to therapy for this, would it be something that like you would probably want to tackle maybe like one emotion at a time? Or would it be something to where, like, obviously we're talking about anger, but typically there's going to be many parts that somebody is either like repressing or having issues with as far as like emotional regulation. So when you're talking about doing shadow work, is it something to where it's like, all right, let's tackle this one thing, or are we just kind of shifting the view in general and then it kind of works for all of the emotions? Like,
no, because I think for some people they struggle with accurate expression and identifying what emotion they're feeling, right? So it's kind of like, I ask you to tell me a story about something that made you angry. And so great, and I say, okay, and I'll give them a feelings, kind of a feelings checklist, so to speak. And I'll say, all right, anger is there, so we're going to circle it. But what other emotions might be there, right? And if you're dealing with an adult who's articulate enough and intelligent enough to really possess just enough insight to at least identify what the emotions are. And then so I'll start to say, okay, well, what is a healthy way to express shame? In fact, if you want to start digging a little bit more into it, it's like, how did your father express shame? How did your mother express shame? How did they encourage negative, quote-unquote, emotions to be expressed? And what you realize is those things were never really encouraged, and they don't know how. And so they want to be taught these other things. The reaction sometimes is, the go-to is anger. But if anger is like the tip of an iceberg, right, and that's the part that the rest of the world sees, that's what we show, well, with an iceberg, 90% of its mass is submerged underwater. And so all of your other emotions are underneath anger. So like when I'm sad, anger comes to the surface. When I'm frustrated, anger comes to the surface. When I'm stressed, anger comes to the surface. When I'm lost and confused, anger comes to the surface. Like, well, anger is the one emotion that we're comfortable expressing. So sometimes you can do multiple things at a time. Other times it's like, okay, let's kind of break this down. Let's look at what are the other emotions you're feeling and how do we start to express those, right? Yeah. And so, does that help?
I just ask because I know a lot of people are probably listening, like, oh, I might be dealing with a few of these things. And just understanding the therapy process, I think for a lot of people, and that kind of, logical framework of how we're going to tackle things. Because one of the biggest things we're actually doing the podcast on, when you need therapy, when to adjust. So that'll be coming up, actually the next one after this. And, some people just don't even really know kind of what to expect. They feel like they might need it, but they're not really sure. So that's why I'm asking some of these questions. So if people are relating to this, it's like, yes, these are the kinds of things that you can work through. Yeah. Maybe one at a time, maybe all together. But yeah, I would say that anger is that was a really good point of how that is usually what's shown,
Mm-hmm.
because it's like this like volatile emotion that comes out, but there's so many other things underneath why that person is probably angry,
Mm-hmm.
and it might not actually be like anger itself.
Right.
It's all these other things that maybe they haven't identified yet, and they might not even know what it is either, you know? I think a lot of times people are just so like, I know that there might be something off with how I handled this or that, but like I don't know what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know why I have this reaction.
Right.
And it's because of all of this stuff that they've suppressed or repressed for so many years that they're not even really aware of it.
Right. And so that's part of the process, is for them to identify what they're feeling and then learn to communicate that with the people that are around them. So that your wife or your husband, when you know you're used to being angry, the person can say, look, I'm angry, but I'm also confused right now. And so through that therapeutic process of me working with that one client, that client can then teach their spouse or their significant others or their children or their neighbor or whatever it is, how to react to them in those ways. Because they're working on changing, so I might need help. When I say this is what I hope you'll do instead, right? And so it starts to go that way. So let me kind of dive a little bit more into like aggression and how this has transformed into shadow work and where it goes. So aggression is considered negative, and kind of like when we talk about the idea of aggression, it's widely considered to be a negative trait. And when we're talking about that, we're talking about like broad social or societal terms. It's widely considered inappropriate to be aggressive, right? So people have been taught, unless you're in a jiu-jitsu class,
I just know a lot of aggressive people, so I'm just like, isn't this the norm for everybody functioning?
No. So people have been taught to be more passive and not really engage in conflict, right? Why? Because what we're doing is we're judging and criticizing aggression. And so what's the opposite side of that? Well, I don't want people to be engaged in conflict. I want you to be passive. I want you to take the path of least resistance.
Or they're passive aggressive.
Right.
That's the worst shit.
So what happens then is that the result of that kind of teaching, right, is that we always feel weak and oppressed, or we feel victimized. And so what happens is that when you finally start to speak to this person who's had years of just repression and not saying anything and bottling everything up inside, you start to talk to that person and you find out they're really angry. Like they're really pissed and they have something to say. And it's finally in the safe environment where they're like, they're expressing to me what's going on, right? And so you're like, oh wow, this person's got a lot of anger. They're full of resentment. They're full of contempt. Like there's a lot of negative space in there. So you start working with that person. And what I try to do is to get them to realize that, hey, you actually have something to say right here. You want them, I want them to start to confront their partner, their neighbor, their friends, whoever it is, with what they're feeling, because they need to give it an outlet. Because if you don't give it an outlet, this is where unconscious motives will find a way out in different behaviors. Okay, it has a mind of its own. If you don't give it an avenue, it's coming out in some way, shape, or form. Whether it stays, whether you keep it inside and it eats away at your health, and you constantly feel stressed and angry and pissed off and bitter at the world, even though you're projecting this super positive, fluffy person, right? And you hate yourself, you hate your life. There's no real joy or excitement in it. You feel lost and empty. Or it starts to manifest in other ways, like you drink more, or you gamble, or you engage in other compulsive behaviors, or you start to withdraw or pull away. There's 1,000 different ways that this stuff starts to manifest. And so we want to start to give that person an outlet, a healthy outlet to express those emotions, right? To say to that person, it's okay to be aggressive right here. It's okay to express your anger, right? Because in expressing that anger, one of the positives and the virtues of it is that you're finally heard. You fucking matter enough to where your anger is justified and that other person deserves to hear it, right? And so it starts to move in that space because it's dangerous to keep it trapped inside you. And so this is the work. We work to integrate it, right? We're becoming that integrated self. We're wanting to take something that our anger has been repressed for years, and so we're looking to move it to the surface and integrate it into a part of who we are. That I'm not a perfect person who's always sweet, kind, and nice, and always going to take the passive way through it and let you walk all over me. I'm going to assert myself. I'm going to speak my mind. You're not going to push me around. I'm going to say what I want to say and feel what I want to feel.
Do you think that gets taken too far to the extreme too?
Of course it can. Everything can be taken too far to the extreme.
But
the idea is about balance.
For the for the individual maybe who has repressed that for a long time, do you feel like there's like a stepwise way to do that? Because I feel like if somebody has truly repressed all of those feelings and there is a lot of anger and contempt and resentment, and then you say to someone, just go and share that with everyone, I feel like they're probably not going to be the most articulate about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what is a way that to like manage that, like to integrate, to like manage integrate it? Because if you were to tell me like, hey, you've really suppressed this, go tell this person, I would say something that would be really not appropriate.
And so
that's what I'm like, and I know that's not what you were saying.
No.
So
one of the ways that I might go about this, and you know, most recent within the last, I don't know, like a month or two, I had a client who had some things that she really wanted to say to her father that she hadn't been expressing. And so one of the things that we did was I told her, I said, just start to write about it. I said, write what you want to say. And so she did, and it was very harsh. Some of it was very harsh. It was, you know, things that, you know, what's the important message here, right? What do we want to get at? Do we want the person to hear our message, or do we just want to beat them over the head?
That's what I'm saying, yeah.
Right? And so one of the things that we decided was I was like, look, you write what you want to say. I said, write it unfiltered the way that you want to say it. And then when she read it back to me, it was kind of like, okay, is there parts of this that you want to change? What parts feel too harsh to you? And so she did. And so we worked to kind of rewrite, to keep some of it the exact same, the way she had written it. Other ways it was like, what's a better way to say this so the person will hear it?
Yeah.
And so we did that. And that was within context of her having a conversation with her father to confront him on this one thing.
I feel like that definitely helps, because I feel like a lot of times, at least, again, maybe this is me as a person, but or people that I know, but like say something, somebody's wronged you, right? And you really, really upset. And this is not just one time they wronged you, it's multiple things that had built up that you let slide. Then one last thing kind of tipped you over that edge, right? And I was having a conversation with someone actually about this, and he was very, very upset. And he could, talk to me about all this, and I was not going to like judge the situation, and and then, he said some of those things, and I was like, listen, like, I hear you, but you can't say that to this other person, because the way that this, I'm not going to get into it, but the way that this other person would have taken it, they would have not listened, ultimately, but then, more importantly, they would have spun it in a way to really showcase that other person's, like, bad like intentions with everybody else. And I was like, they're going to purposely make you look bad if you share this. So it's not like you want to get this message across to this individual because you're hurt, but they're probably not going to care and not listen. So you just need to recognize that. You can tell me, you can tell a few other close people in your life that that other person is going to purposely spin that and make you look bad. So now ultimately you've gotten this off your chest, but you've done nothing to convince the individual that they've done anything wrong, and now they're going to make you look bad. So I was like, you can share this and vent in certain situations, but to that person, it's probably not going to be well received, and actually make you look bad in a situation where you shouldn't look bad, but you're going to, because you're letting this, the way that you're saying it, come across a certain way.
Right.
So I think the writing part is really helpful, because I think just honestly, there's something so cathartic about just getting stuff like that out. Yeah. Which I'm sure, obviously, as a therapist, you probably just hear people just come in and like, what? Like they just share something, right?
Yeah. Sometimes I've done nothing except just listen, and they haven't done anything. Like they're not going out of the session like, I've got to do these things. They just like, said finally what they needed to say.
Yeah, and sometimes that's enough, because it is nice to have like a third. It would be a third. Would you be a third party? Somebody who's not really involved. In
unbiased.
Unbiased person who's not really in their life, you know what I mean? And then they also, like, you're not burdening people in your life with that information, right? Because that can be a big drain. Yeah. Somebody's always, like, dumping on you, and you're like, hey, I love you, but, you know what I mean? So I think that sometimes having a person who's, you don't know, and nobody else, they don't know anybody in your life, ideally, and then you're able to really share that without any real repercussions.
Correct.
But I think that the writing too, if you maybe can't see a therapist or don't want to, the writing I think would be really, really impactful for people.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think sometimes the idea is, can I tap into my anger, this repressed aspect of who I am, and have it lead to the outcomes that I'm looking for. And so if that outcome is to inflict pain and hurt the person, then you're going to accomplish that by using your most harsh words. If the objective is to start to find my assertiveness and start to express myself so that I don't feel victimized, there's ways to get the person to listen to you without hammering them over the head with, your anger, and now you want to like turn it on them. So, and I think this is where another message that, like, it's again to go back to Jordan Peterson, I mentioned I would kind of reference him. He's got a pretty famous bit. I've heard Joe Rogan talk about it several times if you follow Rogan's podcast, where Peterson talks about like the monster inside you and that you should become a monster, right? Well, if you go back to, right, understanding like where some of this comes from, like let's go back to that quote, like from Carl Jung, right? Man as a whole is less good than he wants to be, right? Everyone carries a shadow unless it's embodied in the individual's consciousness, it becomes blacker and denser. And so what he's talking about right here is when Jordan Peterson is making reference to that monster inside you, like you should become a monster, he's talking more or less about like physical aggression, for example. The concept that he's talking about is when he's saying you want to become a monster, what he's saying is that being weak isn't a virtue, right? Not possessing the ability to defend yourself or stand up for yourself isn't a good person. Right, you're not being strong. Assuming the weakness role always leaves you feeling constantly oppressed. It leaves you feeling angry and victimized, right? You're always the victim. And so it's better to acknowledge that aggression, this other side of you exists. That monster that's inside you is there, but learning to control it.
Yeah, so that's the second important part of that quote, is learn how to control it.
A good man isn't a weak man. A good man is a man who understands that he is aggressive but has learned to control it, right? And so this is, and I think sometimes people just want to not listen, and they want to judge again. They want to judge him, they want to judge other people, and they don't want to listen to the message. And so when he's saying you should be a monster, right? He's really talking about this inner conflict within you, like to be aggressive, to be angry, to be all of the things that you're not supposed to be, but recognizing that it exists and learning the ways to control it so that it doesn't harm, right? And so, like, he talks about the angry version of you, okay? And what is anger? Anger is very rigid. Oftentimes it's impulsive, it's short-term. It doesn't think about the past unless it's specifically thinking about the person who hurt you, right? And in which case you'll ruminate on that for a really long time. And it's not concerned with long-term consequences, and it wants to be right, right? And so what happens when that anger, which all human emotions eventually disappear, right? I've talked about this over and over again. Human emotions are temporary, right? You don't stay angry forever, you don't stay sad forever, you don't stay happy forever, you don't stay excited forever. They eventually return back to baseline. So what happens when you return back to baseline and you quote unquote like normalize, and the normal version of you reappears? Well, what happens is we start to reflect on how angry we got. And in many cases, if you recognize that your anger got really out of control and you maybe said and did things that you thought you wouldn't normally do, it starts to reveal parts of yourself. Parts that can be very terrifying for people and horrific to look at, right? And in some cases, like for example, extreme cases where people behaved in ways that they never thought they would, like for example, war, it can create immense psychological stress on the person, okay? And this is where people start to struggle with this concept because we want to put ourselves in a space to be above that, and we're not. The worst atrocities the world has ever seen have been done by mankind and other human beings. You are a human being. You are a part of that system. No one wants to admit that. Everybody wants to look at Nazis like, oh my God, Nazis are this like subclass, this monster, right? People want to look at pedophiles. Like I work with sex offenders. People are always asking me, how can you work with them, right? Do you know what the number one and number two responses are when I tell people that I've worked with sex offenders for treatment? Is kill them and ship them off to an island where they can all live together, right? I don't debate it. I don't even tell people I work with them anymore. Like when I'm on a plane ride, someone's like, what do you do? I'm like, I'm in sanitation. I don't
love trash.
People are like, what? I'm like, yeah.
Recycling really gets me going.
Yeah. And so then, like, the headphones go on. No one wants to talk. Like, I'm like, oh, the flavor.
Have you ever seen a sewer? No, oh, that's for fun.
You know, so no one really asked, but I get tired of almost having the conversation with people, because what they want to do is they want to put these things, they want to put the sex offender, they want to put the Nazi, they want to put these people in a place that villainizes them and demonizes them and separates them from themselves. That creates distance between the threat and them. We don't want to see ourselves as the person who could have been the Nazi. We don't want to see ourselves as the person who could have been the sexual abuser, right? And last time during this podcast, we kind of went through a series of questions where I asked you, like, have you ever been cruel? Have you ever been deliberately, intentionally mean to somebody? Have you ever ignored the consequences? Well, those are all aspects of sex offending. Those are all aspects of being a Nazi, right? And so I'm not saying that those are good things and those are things that we should strive to be, but what I am saying is that monster lives inside all of us. And whatever it is that you find yourself judging other people for lives and breathes within you. And that denial of that, again, there's denial. How do people deal with the shadow? Number one way is denial, and then projection and other ways. But this is exactly how it starts to form. You're a human being, which means you are not void of this discussion. This is a part of you, right? People always talk about the differences between men and women. Well, there's very little differences actually between men and women. On a large enough scale, like with the exception of a few like hormonal things, like a man and a woman are both human beings, which by and large, we're the same, right? It's through kind of social rearing in our culture that creates small differences between us. But human beings are by and large the same. So I think that's the part that makes it a really uncomfortable space, is to start to recognize that this perfect person who you've been your whole life and you've been trying to live up to this image that your parents or that you created for yourself doesn't actually exist. And who's the uglier version, this dark version of you that's been repressed that you haven't shown to the rest of the world? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and then that's, I think the first part, like when you mentioned, so say somebody got really angry and they started to reflect, okay, maybe I said things or did things that I wouldn't normally do, or this, that, and that was just one emotion. Or maybe I was being really judgmental and I said some harsh things or whatever. And then that person reflected and recognized. But that's somebody who's already even starting to reflect and recognize. Like, most people, until they're aware of this or want to be aware of this, right, are not realizing that.
Oh, yeah.
And
correct.
They're having these conversations or these things are happening and they're not thinking about their actions. And I know I used to do that all the time. Like, you know, until you start to recognize those things, and then you're like, oh wait, like what I say and how I act, whether it's out loud or not, you know, is still like a thought pattern that's happening. And I think some people think that it has to be some big, grandiose thing, like somebody started throwing stuff at someone and they were so no, that's not the real stuff. Like those are pretty big deals, but by and large, that's not what's normally happening. You know, it's like those small comments that really cut people down, or it's that judgment that you're making. You may be not even vocalizing it,
sure,
but you're literally saying that. And all of this does not mean that you're never going to have an angry thought or a judgmental thought ever come, you know, into your mind ever again. But the idea is that you maybe have that, and then you say, okay, now how do I maybe not act on it, or not, you know, say this out loud, or how do I redirect my thoughts? It's kind of like anxiety. We're always going to have anxious thoughts, but the idea is recognizing that you had an anxious thought and not letting it spiral and get out of control. Correct. So the same thing with these negative emotions and these things that are repressed and these really just dark, awful parts of you, doesn't mean that you're never going to have those. I mean, I'll literally have some thoughts sometimes where I'm like, bro, what? Like, why would you even think that? You know what I mean? Like, wow. Like, I can literally step back and be like, who is this person inside of me? That was an awful thought. And I would never actually want to say that. And then it's like, okay, well, I'm not going to act on that. Hey, intrusive thoughts, go away. But like, I think there's a big, you have to recognize, like that's a really big part of it, is just even getting to that space. And then working on it can start. Yeah. Because until people recognize that, and that's the confronting that is really uncomfortable, because then you're like, oh wait, I do have these terrible thoughts. Maybe I am a bad person, or not a bad person. Maybe I'm not as
complete as I want to be.
There we go, complete.
Accepting of myself as I want to be.
Yeah, or which then makes me accepting or unaccepting of others.
Correct. And so when we're going to get to judgments in a second, because that's one of the key indicators to people are like, well, where do I start with shadow work? Right? Well, start by exploring the areas you judge other people, like literally. But let me give you an example, because you talked about like it doesn't have to be a grand thing. Like, so have you ever had a confrontation with somebody where you said nothing, but the other person expressed everything that they wanted to say, but you said nothing, and then left the conversation? And as you were thinking about it later, you started to get upset by it because you were like, God, why didn't I say anything? Right? Mm-hmm. And so that's where those questions start to come from.
That was a really targeted question, but yeah. Yes.
I wasn't staring at you.
Story matter. I'm just going to avoid this, and then later.
Yeah. Okay. That's exactly what I'm talking about.
I know. It's horrible.
It's not a huge event in your life where somebody threw something at you, but you're
those things build
having a discussion. The person expresses their opinion. You say nothing, and so later you begin to feel angry about that. You begin to feel angry, and you're replying the conversation, and then the questions start happening. Right? Like, why am I feeling this way? Why did I behave this way? Why didn't I say something? Right? There's that why question, the question that I love so much. And it's like, okay, let's be honest here. If we're going to be honest and answer those questions, it's because the reason you didn't respond in the way that you wanted is because you have repressed your anger and you don't believe that using it for its potential good, because you've been told that it's wrong your whole life. So you've accepted a life where you're not strong, you're afraid to be assertive, and you will let people walk away, right? And so this again goes back to that statement I made earlier. The impractical and negative aspects of anger are used as a deterrent, which represses all other possibilities that the emotion of anger encompasses, which are the positives to it.
And then the irony is that you're still angry.
Correct.
You know what I mean? So like you're trying to repress something, but now you just end up living that out for yourself and creating more of that for yourself because you're drawing it in because that's all that you can focus on and ruminate. So it's like this weird self-fulfilling situation where you are trying to actively avoid this, and then but really you're acting that out more and you're still feeling that way.
And the work becomes in those like 2 or 3 little sentences that I said. It's admitting that I'm afraid, that I'm not strong, and that I'm not assertive. That's why I didn't say anything. Those are negative things to think about yourself. Those are harsh realities to come to grips with. And you can start to dive down the rabbit hole. Where did I receive this message from? Who was the first person who started telling me to shut my mouth, to not speak my truths about the world? We did a whole podcast on attachment theory, right? And I started to talk about attachment theories, right? When you're attached to people and your attachment relationships for survival, and the need for authenticity, where you start to express your truths about the world and your opinions about the world. If those opinions start to threaten your attachment relationships, well, what happens? You have to make a choice, either my survival or my authenticity. Well, what are you going to choose? Your survival, right? So you start to silence yourself. These are messages that we've all encountered. Now, some people less than others, some more than others. It's about your personal journey. It's not necessarily condemning it. It's just acknowledging that that exists. And so, for many people, it's learning to acknowledge the positive sides of something that has been negative for years in your mind, and recognizing that that has a role and a space within it, right? It's kind of like, I don't know, confirmation biases, where somebody presents 10 facts, right? And let's say 6 of them are positive, right? Reasons you should do this. But 4 of them are negative, right? So I'm going to ignore all 6 of the positives because I know that there's a handful of negative ones that come with it. So I don't do it, right? What did I just do? I've completely negated all the positive aspects that come with it. And this is what we've done with anger, with aggression, with the repressed aspects of who we are. We've shoved it into a space where we don't deal with it anymore.
And I think because, again, we'll continue with the anger example, when you are repressing that and then you do try to use it, a lot of times you are using it in that negative sense because you don't know how to communicate it. You know what I mean? So you are using anger in that negative sense because you've stuffed everything down and you've avoided it, or you've not dealt with it. You don't want to confront it. And then when it does come out, you are in this kind of really negative, angry space. And then it's like, I think that's partly probably why some people again, it confirms, oh, well, yeah, see, anger is negative, anger is bad, because anytime that I do let this out, this happens, and then there's those repercussions. So I think that, again, it becomes this kind of like self-fulfilling thing until you recognize, like, okay, this is here, this is not going to go away, how can I actually navigate it, use it for the positives, and then also integrate things in a better way so that when I do get angry, I know how to speak to people.
Correct.
It doesn't mean that I have to suppress myself, but it doesn't mean that I get to yell at everybody either, because neither of those are quite effective.
Yeah, exactly. So the key to shadow work is to accept, not ignore the aspects of these opposing forces in your life. It's to learn that they're real and that they're possible. And so, think about it like this. To compete in something, for example, in almost anything, it requires that person to be dangerous or powerful. And just because you're powerful and dangerous, it doesn't make you a bad person, right? This is where having an understanding of man's virtues are important, and understanding what other principles and virtues are also guiding you as well, right? You can become a force for good, but in doing so, become a person who also understands evil. And so what happens is in that position, you choose not to participate in the evil because you aren't controlled by it. You don't feel as compelled by it. You become more aware and are able to integrate that aspect of yourself into your consciousness, to know that you're dangerous. People can use 1,000 different metaphors for it. It's like knowing that, you possess the ability to hurt people, but don't, right? It's knowing that you have a carry and conceal permit, but don't pull out your gun because somebody cuts you off in traffic, right? It's learning to control that because there's a time and a space. It's knowing that you possess the ability to hurt somebody, to defend yourself, to protect what's important, but to not engage in just random acts of violence or hurting somebody so that you can feel powerful and strong. So this concept really falls more under, there is strength, but it's under control, demonstrating power without undue harshness. And that's of value. That's what makes a person good. And I think those things get lost. So to kind of wrap up, one activity that I want to give you guys, if you want to start working on some shadow work for yourselves, is where do we start? Well, the first thing I would tell anybody to do if you really are interested in starting some of your own shadow work is, number one, pay attention to whatever things create strong emotional responses within you, right? Whatever you feel like super passionate about, start to explore that. And also start to explore spaces where you are judging other people, right? This is kind of a common thing. This is just something that you guys can start to do. Like, take out a piece of paper and write down this. Say, they do this. They do that. They are wrong, ... right? They should be fought against for, right? And so what are we doing? I'm getting you to start to recognize what your judgments are. Some of you might have heard those statements and said, like when I said, they do this, right? Immediately something pops into your head and you're like, oh, they do whatever. Right? Or they do that, or they're doing this wrong. And so when I'm saying they, what we're doing is we're projecting this into the outside world. Projection, there's a key word, right? I'm judging it. I should be aware of that judgment. Why? Because if I listen to this podcast, I know that what I'm judging somebody else for is also within me. And so this is where the acceptance comes in. Where's that judgment coming from, right? Do I do these things? And I don't want to see myself as the person who does these things, right? And sometimes we just have people who are in complete denial about this stuff, right? It's the guy standing in the gym, like looking at the Mr. Olympia, contestants or whatever they're called, competitors, athletes, and he's like, they're only up there because they do steroids, as he's got a needle hanging out of his ass, you know what I mean? And then you're like, but you're doing steroids. And he's like, well, I have to do it in order to compete with them, right? Well, no, you don't. You don't have to do it. And so they're going to never do this. I know you've had people in your life, and I have too, people who are like, they'll literally be talking to you about something that somebody else is doing in their life. They're like, I can't believe they're doing this. I can't believe they're cheating. I can't believe they're lying. I can't believe they're acting in this way. And yet, they have literally done the exact same thing. They just don't see it within themselves. And so it's that weird defense part of us where it's like, I've got to see myself as good and whole and I've got to look at the rest of the world as evil so that it justifies this kind of victim mentality, and that I keep myself whole and preserved when I'm really not whole.
Yeah,
and I'm not good.
And that's the hard part, you know what I mean? Once you start to recognize, like, wow, I used to judge people for this, and then you find yourself there.
Yeah.
Or, you know, when I was talking to somebody about, we were talking about meditation, we were having an Instagram live, and he was asking about like meditation and mindfulness and just some different stuff that we were, you know, he's been diving into, and some stuff that I've been sharing. And, you know, he made a really great point that through just simply being more mindful and meditating, just judging people less, by simply just being aware of things more, like whether it's your own self or how you know, move throughout the world. And I was like, you know, that is such like a great byproduct of that, simply just being mindful of yourself and your intentions. And for whatever reason, like that, like there's a bunch of different ways that people can meditate. So it's not just about like, you know, sitting there. And that was one thing we were talking about, like, you know, everybody has this idea of like this like monk meditating like in a forest or like a fairy and everything's like perfect and you're like levitating. It's like, that's not what most meditation is for people. I mean, some people, they can certainly achieve that, but for most people it's like a 10-minute guided meditation, or it's, you know, they're sitting in the sauna and they're just able to reflect on their thoughts. But just creating that space to be able to reflect on thoughts, whether that's written or with a therapist, or just kind of, you know, sitting and letting those things come to mind, is really how all this is going to start.
Yeah, and Carl Jung believed a lot in like dream analysis, which is where this stuff comes from. He used to pay attention to studying dreams, and he was heavy into mythology and symbolism, and so people look for symbols all the time. They're always looking for signs, right? And so, you know, you start to pay attention to dreams, you start to pay attention to signs, you start to pay attention to fantasies, okay? People are like, what fantasies do I look for? Well, start with ones where maybe you have fantasies of revenge on a person, right? That should start tapping into a part of you that you have been, you know, probably repressing and haven't expressed. And we've all had them, okay? So if you're listening to this, like, it's totally normal, you're fine. You're a human being, it's all good. Don't judge yourself for it. Again, move away from concepts of good and evil, right and wrong, and start to move toward, I want to be a more whole and complete person who can accept myself. And that's when you start to see changes in self-worth, in thinking, in behavior, and you become less frustrated with other people and more accepting of other human beings and their flaws, because you can see yourself within them. And so the one thing you don't want to be denied is forgiveness from other people for making the same mistakes. But, you know, it's very easy. And some people will never forgive other people for things that they've done because they refuse to see it within themselves, you know, for the exact same things that they refuse to forgive you for, they're doing just maybe to other people. So you learn to adjust to the idea that fairness doesn't exist, and we start to challenge those irrational belief systems that were developed as children with our adult minds. And you can confront these aspects of yourself to become complete and whole. And that's the goal of this type of work. So I hope that provided a basic understanding to start to do some of your own work.
And I know I kind of derailed us with some of my questions, but I want to make sure that when people are listening, it's not just so like...
I'm sure you'll hear about it in the comments section.
Sure I will. I went on YouTube last time. I fucking loved my introductions on Carl Jung's podcast. Like, as if... Anyways, I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to get angry. You know, I'm just going to let it. Anyways, yes, I think this was great. If you guys have any other questions for us, you can submit those through the link in the show notes. I'll also put Rick's contact information, but say that out loud for everybody to hear.
Full Circle Therapy.
Perfect.
At gmail.com.
Yeah, okay. Just type that in and it'll not get sent. It'll be in the outbox forever. So Full Circle Therapy at gmail.com. And then for...
Full Circle Therapy FL.
Oh, you don't even know your own damn email.
I don't.
It is definitely... Okay, Full Circle
Therapy FL. At gmail.com.
We'll put it in the show notes. And for all information about coaching, visit teamlocofit.com, and our app will be released very, very soon. So there is a page to be the first to hear about it. So that is redefinehealthyapp.com. So you can check that out. We'll put all of that in the show notes, and we will talk to you guys next week.